Okay, so last week we talked about critical voice and how over time, like the negative things that people said to us, usually during our developmental years, like parents and teachers and coaches, becomes more and more extreme. And we think that the best way of motivating ourselves is to talk down to ourselves and to point out our flaws. And we've actually amplified those negative messages over the course of our lifetime to become a pretty big monster that resides in our head and makes, our relationship with ourselves pretty crappy. And so last time we talked about mindfulness of thoughts, identifying cognitive distortions when they're present in your critical voice and rewriting those in non-distorted manners, and also the encouragement skill from the distress tolerance improve acronym. So all kind of ways to look at rewriting it, because we know that neuroplasticity, if that's the way we've kind of defaulted to talking to ourselves for a really long time, then it's become, like the freeway in our mind. And so we're starting to build these new pathways of a more compassionate and a more kind way of relating to ourselves and motivating ourselves. And so we're starting out, and those are just little baby dirt roads right now. But over time, if we choose, to go to that instead of going to our default critical voice, we can build those up, and that can become our default in itself, our new default. So today I want to talk about self-compassion, and this is based on Kristin Neff's work. And so compassion for emotionally sensitive people is something that we tend to have plenty of. Like, most people consider us to be compassionate, giving, loving individuals, right? Like, out in the world, that is what we do. We're kind, we're loving. However, that tends to not be what we do with ourselves, right? We're pretty critical. And so it's taking that perspective of how we treat others in the world and applying it back to ourselves, that we are also deserving of love and kindness and being given the benefit of the doubt and being built up even when we make mistakes, because all human beings make mistakes. And so we're going to talk about self-compassion today on the point of 3 dialectics. And so you can think of each of these as kind of a spectrum of very compassionate to least compassionate. And then in any given moment, you can be anywhere on all 3 of these spectrums. But the goal being that we can always choose to move more towards self-compassion. So the first dialectic is self-kindness versus self-judgment. Very DBT, right? We know that judgments are shortcuts for our brain, that it likes them because it doesn't involve thought. We don't have to put any effort into it. If I can check this box, then I can move this person or this thing or whatever into the same box as all these other people that I know information about, and I don't have to put effort into it. Judgments for ourselves keep us stuck in old behaviors, right? Especially if they're all-consuming judgments. Things like, I am worthless, I suck, I'm not smart enough, or I'm stupid. All those are evaluations of you in totality, right? And it's really hard to problem solve if you believe any of those things about yourself, because they're evaluations. And so the opposite of judgments is self-kindness. What ways can I rewrite those statements to pull the judgments out, just like we talked about pulling the distortions out last week, and practice kindness? And again, kind of coming back to this idea of a toddler, right? We would never say the things we say to ourselves to a young child that's developing. And yet we think that it's okay for us to speak to our own brain in this negative way, and that it will, result in success, right? If I am mean enough to myself long enough, I will get to the person I want to be. That's just not the case. So how can I be kind to myself today? How can I let that judgment go and practice seeing myself in the way that I would see a young child or the person that is struggling, right? Because most of us are struggling. Giving ourselves compassion that we're doing the best we can and we can still do better. That's one of those dialectics we talk about in the beginning. Letting go of judgments. Recognizing when you're having judgments and going, no, this is just my critical voice. Maybe even going back to the activity where you've labeled your critical voice as a cartoon character or a politician or somebody that exists out in the greater, thing, but you've given it some characterization. And recognizing you can also have a positive voice. If we've created a characterization of negativity, we can also create a characterization of positivity that resides within us, and that can build us up instead of breaking us down. Because especially for emotionally sensitive people, breaking us down until we get better very rarely works, especially when we have trauma histories. Okay, so the second continuum is isolation versus common humanity. And common humanity, again, very much ties in with the DBT, like the dialectics of we are all connected. And the best example I can give for this is living in Houston. So I lived like 40 minutes away from U of H when I was getting my master's degree. And I timed, the traffic pretty well to know how to get to class on time. But the thing about living in Houston is you can leave your house at the exact same time every single day, and it can take 2 hours one day and 30 minutes the next day. It's just unpredictable, it's huge, and there's lots and lots of cars. And so we as Houstonians have all dealt with not making it to something on time. No matter how cope ahead you are, no matter how much you've planned, if you're going somewhere that's more than 5 minutes from your house, you've gotten caught in unexpected traffic. It just happens. And so in those moments, we can choose to beat ourselves up and say like, oh, you're so stupid. Why didn't you plan for this? You should have been like on top of it, right? All those judgments can come in. Or we can choose to focus on common humanity, that every single person who lives in this entire area has experienced exactly what I am now. And so while they may be frustrated in the moment, like, because, right, anger is the justified emotion when a goal is being blocked, we can all understand what it's like to have every intention to be somewhere on time and to not make it because something is completely out of our control. And so, like, that's a simple example, but so many times we would give other people the benefit of the doubt, but we wouldn't give it to ourselves. And so just like that kindness, can I give myself the same level of grace that I would give somebody I care about? Okay, and the final one is mindfulness versus over-identification. Have you ever had those really bad moods where you're like, I am the sadness. It's never gonna leave me. It's just here. It's residing in my soul now. The sadness is me. That is over-identification. As emotionally sensitive people, we can get into over-identification, right? Like, especially when we have more than one negative emotion, right? Like the shame and the sadness are never gonna leave. So how does mindfulness become the opposite end of this? Well, with mindfulness, we know that all emotions are just states, that they pass, that they come and go like waves. We know that through mindfulness, we can identify things like prompting events, vulnerability factors, body changes, after effects, right? Through mindfulness, we can see that what feels like it's all consuming is actually pretty temporary. And when we're not being self-compassionate, we're usually beating ourselves up, right? Like we're thinking about all the negative and reminding ourselves that like this too shall pass. All things pass. All emotions pass, all physiological states pass, all trials, all traumas. The world keeps spinning. And so like this idea that like I am bigger than this moment, and even though it feels all consuming, it will pass. So that wraps up my little Kristin Neff thing, and I hope this is helpful. And I'll see you guys next week.